When a power-hungry HOA queen tries to seize my land, I lock the gate and uncover a secret that turns her empire to dust. Watch how one homeowner's fight becomes a neighborhood's triumph. Imagine a seemingly ordinary neighborhood dispute escalating into an epic battle of wills, where one homeowner's locked gate becomes the symbol of defiance against a tyrannical HOA queen, leading to a revenge so perfectly ironic, it reshapes the entire community forever. "Open the gate or I'm calling the National Guard," Karen screeched at the top of her lungs, pounding on my steel fence like she was auditioning for a demolition derby, while three men in neon vests stood awkwardly behind her, holding measuring tapes and clipboards, unsure if they had just walked into a neighborhood dispute or a hostage negotiation. I leaned casually on my side of the locked gate, sipping coffee from a mug that said, "Not today, HOA," letting the absurdity of the moment stretch like a rubber band about to snap. My heart pounding not from fear but from the sheer insanity of this woman thinking she could send surveyors onto my property without my permission and expect me to bow down. 10 seconds in and the whole neighborhood had their phones out recording kids laughing from their yards and Karen turning redder than a fire hydrant as she screamed about legal authority that didn't exist. And that right there was the exact second I knew this war was going to end badly for her and beautifully for me. But to understand how we got here, you need to know what happened just a few hours earlier when my Sunday morning peace was first invaded by the queen of HOA chaos herself. It started with me mowing my own lawn, headphones in, country music blasting, enjoying the quiet victory of having survived a full week without Karen banging on my door about trash cans or mailbox paint shade. The sky was bright, the coffee was strong, and life felt good until a caravan of trucks rolled up to my driveway like a low-budget military operation. I pulled my headphones down and watched as three men hopped out. One holding a survey tripod, another a clipboard, and the third looking like he regretted ever answering Karen's Craigslist ad. Then she emerged from her SUV like a villain in a daytime soap opera, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, barking orders about property lines as if she were preparing to annex my yard like some HOA Napoleon. She didn't even look at me when she said, "We're expanding the HOA boundary fence. Half your yard technically belongs to the association," like she was reciting a weather forecast. Then waved at the men to start hammering stakes in my soil. My blood boiled, but instead of yelling, I smiled, the kind of slow, dangerous grin that makes people nervous. I asked for her paperwork. She shoved a half-crumpled printout in my face that looked like it had been scribbled by a drunk raccoon. I told her to leave. She said, "You can't stop progress." That's when I decided this wasn't just going to be another HOA headache. This was going to be the day the tide turned. As the surveyors spread out on my property, I calmly walked to my garage, grabbed a pair of bolt cutters, and marched to the gate. Karen was too busy lecturing a bird about community standards to notice until she heard the loud click of the chain lock snapping shut. She spun around just in time to see me slide a second padlock through the latch. My face the picture of quiet rebellion. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, stomping toward me. But the man had already paused, sensing a storm brewing. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Protecting my land from trespassers. If you're so sure you're right, call the cops. Or better yet, call a lawyer. Either way, you're not setting foot past this gate until you show me something that isn't a kindergarten crayon drawing." The neighbors, by now gathering like spectators at a gladiator match, snickered and whispered, some openly rooting for me. Karen, not used to losing control of a situation, sputtered and threatened to fine me, to sue me, to have me removed from the neighborhood. I sipped my coffee and reminded her that I own this property free and clear and the only thing being removed today would be her crew if they didn't back off. But Karen never backed off, she doubled down. She called in reinforcements, texting half the HOA board and claiming I had taken her people hostage, painting herself as the victim of my tyranny. Meanwhile, her surveyors, realizing they'd been sent into a territorial war zone without hazard pay, began quietly packing their gear. One even whispered, "Man, she didn't say it was going to be like this," before tiptoeing back to his truck. And yet Karen, too stubborn to admit defeat, planted herself at my gate and screamed into her phone, "Send more men. We're taking this yard today." That was when the idea hit me. Not just to stop her nonsense, but to flip the entire script on her. See, Karen thought she owned this neighborhood, thought she could bully and fine and harass everyone until they either moved out or bent to her ridiculous rules. But in that moment, staring at her red furious face and hearing the hollow bravado in her threats, I realized something. The woman had built her entire HOA empire on shaky ground, and I wasn't talking metaphorically. There were whispers in the neighborhood about how she'd extended the HOA clubhouse a few feet past its actual boundary, that maybe part of her precious HOA headquarters sat on land she didn't fully own. I hadn't cared before, but after this stunt, I cared a lot. And suddenly, the thought of not just defending my yard, but taking hers in return lit a fire in me that even Karen couldn't extinguish. That was the first battle line drawn in what would become a war of locked gates, legal maneuvers, public humiliation, and a final twist so sweet it would make the entire neighborhood cheer. But back then, as Karen stomped and screamed outside my gate like a cartoon villain denied entry to a castle, I just smiled wider, pulled out my phone, and started recording. If this was how she wanted to play. She had no idea that I was about to turn her entire kingdom upside down. I woke up the next morning still riding the high of having slammed the gate on Karen's power trip. But there was no illusion that yesterday's drama was the end of it. If there was one thing I had learned living under Karen's reign of HOA terror, it was that she never lost quietly. The woman had the persistence of a raccoon in a locked trash can. She'd scratch, claw, and make a racket until she either got in or set the whole neighborhood on fire metaphorically. As I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of pancakes and my second cup of coffee, my phone started buzzing like a beehive on fire. Texts and emails poured in from neighbors. Some congratulating me on finally putting Karen in her place. Others warning me she'd called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss your illegal interference with community improvements. I nearly choked on my pancakes at that wording. Illegal interference. She'd sent strangers to trample my yard. Hammer stakes like they were building a carnival. And somehow I was the criminal. That was Karen's superpower. Turning her own mess into someone else's fault. I knew right then I had to outthink her, not just out-yell her. Yelling matched her energy, but beating her at her own game would crush the ego she protected like Fort Knox. So, I dragged out my dusty filing cabinet, threw on an old baseball cap, and began digging through every property deed, HOA charter, and map I owned. My buddy Luke came over halfway through holding 2 coffees and a bag of donuts, his eyes already wide with curiosity. "Heard you started a war," he said, dropping into a chair like he was settling in for a movie. I told him what happened. Every absurd detail from the fake surveyors to Karen's screaming threats. And by the end, Luke was shaking his head, muttering, "She's finally gone too far." Luke wasn't just a friend. He had an uncle who worked in real estate law, which made him my unofficial legal consultant. We spread the documents out like detectives working a high-profile case, highlighting every clause that could potentially work in my favor. That's when Luke pointed out a tiny footnote in the HOA charter that no one ever read because Karen never let anyone else handle the paperwork. It stated that any land dispute initiated by the HOA required unanimous board approval and verified third-party surveys before action could be taken. Unanimous approval. Verified surveys. Karen had neither. She'd acted alone like a self-appointed land queen. I leaned back in my chair, grinning, because this wasn't just a defense. This was ammunition. If I played it right, not only could I block her nonsense, but I could drag her through her own bureaucratic maze until she tripped and landed flat on her smug face. Luke laughed when I told him my plan. But it wasn't just about blocking her. It was about laying a trap, one she'd be too arrogant to see coming. We decided to attend her so-called emergency meeting, not to argue, but to watch her dig her own grave with that big mouth of hers. And oh boy, did she deliver. That evening, the HOA clubhouse was packed like a courtroom during a juicy trial. Karen stood at the front, her face a mask of fake concern, recounting how I had illegally detained her licensed surveyors, describing my locked gate like it was Fort Knox, and me as a deranged outlaw standing guard with weapons of mass destruction instead of coffee and bolt cutters. She ended her dramatic performance by saying, "We cannot let one man's selfishness stop community progress." While half the room stifled laughter, remembering her screaming meltdown yesterday. When she opened the floor for questions, I stood up calmly, holding a copy of the HOA charter in my hand. I asked her in front of everyone if she had unanimous board approval for yesterday's stunt. She froze, blinked, then sputtered something about urgent executive decisions. I pressed further, asking if the surveys were from licensed professionals since the men she brought looked like they'd been pulled from a hardware store parking lot on a Saturday morning. Murmurs filled the room, the board members shifting uncomfortably as Karen tried to spin excuses, each one weaker than the last. By the time I sat down, the seed of doubt had been planted in every HOA member's mind, and Karen's perfect image had a visible crack. That alone felt like a win. But it wasn't enough. I needed leverage, something to make sure she couldn't regroup and come at me again with another half-baked power grab. That's when Luke brought up a rumor he'd heard for years. That part of the HOA building itself, the one Karen treated like her personal palace, had been built slightly beyond its official boundary lines, possibly on what used to be privately owned land. No one had cared because the previous owner never challenged it. But with Karen's antics escalating, I suddenly cared a lot. If that rumor was true, and if I could prove it, the irony of her screaming about my fence while her own headquarters was on shaky legal ground would be delicious. That night, Luke and I pored over old city records online, satellite images, anything that could give us a clue. At 2 a.m., we found an old survey map from decades ago showing the property line in a way that didn't match the HOA's current fence placement. We couldn't be certain yet, but it was enough to make my next move clear. Tomorrow, I'd go down to the county records office, get an official copy, and if my suspicion was right, I wouldn't just defend my land. I'd prepare to take hers. The idea made me laugh out loud. A sound so evil that even my dog gave me side. Karen thought she was untouchable, the queen of this neighborhood, fining people for having flowers the wrong color or lawn chairs a shade too bright. But if this worked, I'd be the one with the upper hand, and she wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. As I finally crawled into bed, exhausted, but buzzing with excitement, I thought about every time Karen had harassed me, every petty letter, every ridiculous demand, every smug grin when she thought she'd won. Tomorrow was the start of something bigger than revenge. It was the start of dismantling her entire throne brick by brick. And for the first time since buying this house, I felt like I wasn't just surviving Karen's HOA dictatorship anymore. I was about to overthrow it. The next day, the sun was barely over the horizon when I was already in my truck with a folder under my arm and a plan forming in my head, my mind running faster than the engine as I headed toward the county records office. The thrill of what I might uncover had me wide awake despite the 3 hours of sleep I'd managed. Every nerve buzzing at the thought of turning Karen's endless harassment into the trap that would finally undo her. Walking into that office felt like stepping into the vault where every secret of this neighborhood had been locked away. And as I sifted through decades-old maps, dusty property surveys, and faded legal documents, the picture began to sharpen. Karen's precious HOA building, her self-proclaimed palace of authority, had its eastern wing jutting several feet over the legal boundary line right onto what was marked as privately owned land decades ago. The previous owner of my property had never contested it, probably too tired or too kind-hearted to deal with Karen's predecessor, but now those inches had grown into several feet of arrogance that could cost her everything. I paid for certified copies of the documents, tucking them into my folder like a winning lottery ticket, knowing this wasn't just a weapon, it was the whole arsenal. Driving back, my grin only widened as I imagined the look on Karen's face when I revealed it. But first, I needed to secure my own territory. When I got home, Luke was already there leaning against my gate with 2 coffees and a grin that matched mine. We spent the next few hours transforming my property line into a fortress, adding new chains, bright no trespassing signs, and even a couple of motion sensor sprinklers for comic effect. If Karen or her hired goons wanted another attempt at reclaiming my yard, they'd leave soaking wet and empty-handed. We were still laughing about the image of Karen screeching as water drenched her when we heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel and looked up to see her SUV crawling toward my driveway like a tank on a mission. She stepped out with that same overconfident strut, holding a fresh stack of papers and accompanied by 2 different men in hard hats. As if rotating surveyors would change the legality of what she was doing, she stood at the locked gate, shouting that yesterday's situation had been a misunderstanding and that today's crew was fully authorized. I didn't even move from my lawn chair as I sipped my drink and asked if she had unanimous board approval and certified surveys this time. She ignored the question, barking at the men to hop the fence and begin marking territory again. That's when the sprinklers activated, shooting powerful streams of water over the fence and soaking both workers before they even reached the gate. The men cursed, backing away and glaring at Karen, who was screaming at me that I would regret this childishness. My only reply was to hold up my phone, live streaming the whole scene to our neighborhood group chat. Within minutes, half the block had joined in the comments, mocking Karen's soggy henchman, and calling this the most entertainment they'd had in months. Humiliation wasn't enough for her, though. Karen's temper only grew hotter. She threatened to fine me $10,000 for obstruction. Called her husband, who showed up 15 minutes later, only to turn red with embarrassment as his wife yelled through a fence like a villain in a cartoon. But every minute they stood there shouting, and every drop of water soaking her new surveyors was another nail in the coffin she was building for herself. Finally, defeated and dripping, she stormed off, swearing she'd be back with legal force. Luke and I watched her go, both knowing that every outburst only made her case weaker and mine stronger. With the documents I had in my folder, her next attempt would backfire harder than she imagined. But before I unleashed that weapon, I needed more evidence, the kind that would make her surrender impossible. That night, under cover of darkness, Luke and I grabbed flashlights, measuring tape, and a video camera, heading to the HOA building when the streets were quiet. We moved like burglars, half laughing, half dead serious, as we measured from the official boundary markers to the far corner of the HOA headquarters. Just as the old maps had suggested, the building extended several feet over the property line, right into land that, according to county records, belonged to me. We filmed everything, narrating the measurements, laughing quietly about how poetic this was, that the woman who had tried to steal my yard had been illegally sitting on mine for years. The evidence was rock solid, and as we packed up, I felt a surge of satisfaction unlike anything I'd known since moving here. This wasn't just a win waiting to happen. This was justice served cold with a side of irony. The next morning, I drafted a formal notice using a template Luke's uncle had emailed me. It was sharp, professional, and devastatingly clear. The HOA had no legal standing to touch my property. And furthermore, a portion of their own building was unlawfully encroaching on my land. If immediate negotiations weren't opened, I would proceed with legal action to claim my rights, including potential ownership of the section of their beloved headquarters that sat on my soil. I printed copies, had them notarized, and dropped them into Karen's mailbox with a smile before sitting back to watch the storm I'd unleashed. It didn't take long. Within an hour, Karen was pounding on my locked gate again. Screaming threats mixed with desperate bargaining. The shift in tone delicious to witness. The queen of HOA fines was now begging me not to cause chaos for the community, suddenly pretending to care about harmony. I told her simply that this wasn't personal. It was about property rights, the same one she tried to trample, and if she wanted peace, it would be on my terms. Now behind her, several HOA board members were whispering to each other, glancing nervously at the papers in their hands, realizing the woman they'd blindly followed had not only failed to take my land, but had put their own headquarters at risk. The power dynamics of the neighborhood were shifting, and for the first time, Karen looked like she knew it. But I wasn't celebrating yet. This was only the start of a much bigger game, one where every move mattered and every mistake could tip the scales. I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was preparing to plant my flag in the very heart of her kingdom, and I could feel the entire neighborhood waiting with bated breath to see who would emerge victorious in this war of gates, maps, and pure stubborn will. The day after I delivered the notice, the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt like the tension before a thunderstorm. Everyone waiting for lightning to strike and wondering who it would hit first. Karen's SUV wasn't parked in its usual spot outside her house. Instead, it sat outside the HOA building like a war wagon guarding a castle under siege. Rumors were spreading fast. Whispers that the mighty Karen had been caught trespassing on someone else's land for years, that her precious headquarters wasn't as legally secure as she'd claimed. Some neighbors pretended to side with her out of fear of her wrath. But I could see the flicker of excitement in their eyes every time they glanced at my locked gate or the thick envelope of documents I carried under my arm. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was turning into a spectacle. And deep down, people wanted to see the tyrant fall. That morning, I put on my best shirt, grabbed my folder of evidence, and marched to the county office to file an official property encroachment claim. The clerk barely blinked when I handed over the stack of maps, photos, and videos, simply stamping them with a bored efficiency that belied the bombshell I had just dropped on our HOA. With the paperwork now officially in motion, the next step was making it public. I printed out copies of my notice and slipped them discreetly into the mailboxes of every HOA board member, knowing full well that once they read it, panic would ripple through Karen's little empire like a crack through glass. By noon, my phone was blowing up with messages from neighbors asking if it was true, if I really had proof that Karen's headquarters sat on my land. I responded to a few with a simple yes, and soon screenshots of my documents were circulating in the neighborhood group chat. By late afternoon, Karen was pacing outside the HOA building, barking into her phone while 3 board members stood nearby, looking like they'd just been told their house was built on quicksand. I stayed on my porch, calm, sipping iced tea and watching the chaos unfold. The plan now was not to gloat, but to keep tightening the noose until she realized the only way out was surrender on my terms. The next HOA meeting was called that same evening. This time not by Karen, but by a frantic vice president, desperate to clarify recent misunderstandings. Luke and I went, taking seats near the front, while Karen glared at me with eyes that could strip paint off a car. The tension was thick, the room packed with homeowners who smelled blood in the water. The meeting started with Karen trying to regain control, insisting the whole thing was a paperwork glitch, that my claim was frivolous, and that I was trying to destroy the community spirit. But when I calmly stood, opened my folder, and began reading aloud from official county records, complete with stamp dates and notarized signatures, the room shifted. Murmurs turned into gasps, heads turned toward Karen, and one board member asked her outright why they were only hearing about this now. Karen sputtered excuses, blaming the previous property owner, blaming city officials, blaming anyone but herself, but the damage was done. I finished my statement by announcing that unless the HOA agreed to negotiate a settlement within 2 weeks, my lawyer would pursue full legal rights over the portion of land their building occupied, which could lead to partial ownership of the HOA headquarters itself. The silence that followed was golden, the kind of silence that means everyone in the room knows the balance of power just flipped. Karen tried to laugh it off, but her voice cracked, betraying the panic she desperately wanted to hide. I left the meeting without another word. My point made, and as Luke and I walked home under the streetlights, we could hear the buzzing of whispers behind us. The whole neighborhood processing what they just witnessed. The next morning, Karen came to my gate alone. No clipboard, no surveyors, just a pale face and trembling hands clutching a cup of coffee. She tried a softer tone, talking about finding common ground, saying this had gotten out of hand. I listened politely, then reminded her that this only started because she tried to bulldoze my rights without asking. I told her any settlement would have to include a full written apology, withdrawal of any past fine she had issued me, and a guarantee that no future boundary disputes would ever be raised again. The look on her face was priceless, like I'd asked her to give up her crown and kneel in the dirt. She left without agreeing, but I knew I had her cornered. Over the next few days, Karen tried every trick in the book to claw her way back into control. She held secret HOA meetings without inviting me. She sent out emails claiming my claim was fabricated. She even had a lawyer friend send me a laughable letter threatening a countersuit for defamation. But every time I responded with calm, cold facts backed by county documents and legal citations. And each time her supporters thinned a little more. Even her closest allies on the board were whispering to me privately, saying they just wanted this nightmare over, that Karen was making everything worse. Meanwhile, I prepared my next move, filing a motion for preliminary injunction to halt any HOA use of the disputed portion of land until the case was resolved. If the court granted it, Karen would have to rope off part of her beloved headquarters like a condemned building, a humiliation I almost felt guilty about. Almost. The day I filed, a local news crew that loved neighborhood drama showed up asking for comments. I kept it classy, saying I just wanted my property rights respected, while Karen, caught off guard, ranted about ungrateful residents and fake claims on live TV. The clip went viral in our town, turning her into a laughingstock overnight. That evening, as I watched the footage with Luke, we both knew the war was nearly won. But it wasn't enough to beat her. It had to be final, indisputable, the kind of defeat that made sure she never tried this with me or anyone else again. My lawyer was preparing the final legal steps. But I had one more card to play, one that would make Karen feel exactly what every homeowner under her HOA dictatorship had felt for years. Powerless. It was time to show her what it felt like to have someone else decide the fate of a building you thought you controlled. My claim was now public record, my injunction pending, and the deadline for her to respond was ticking down. In just days, either Karen would bow out gracefully, or the county sheriff would deliver papers, making it clear that I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was about to own a piece of hers, and for the first time, Karen seemed to understand that she was standing on ground that could be pulled out from under her any second. The day of the hearing arrived like a storm cloud that everyone in the neighborhood had seen coming but couldn't stop. A mix of dread and excitement humming through the air as people whispered about how the great Karen would finally be forced to face the music in a courtroom instead of behind the safety of her HOA podium. I drove to the courthouse with Luke riding shotgun, the folder of evidence sitting on the dashboard like a silent promise that today would be the day the balance shifted for good. My stomach was tight, not from fear, but from the gravity of what was about to unfold. Because this wasn't just about me and a stolen yard anymore. It was about standing up to years of harassment and showing every homeowner under Karen's thumb that the HOA tyrant could bleed. When we walked into the courtroom, Karen was already there, flanked by a smug-looking attorney in a suit that screamed overconfidence and desperation rolled into one. She avoided my eyes, focusing instead on her pile of color-coded binders that I suspected were full of her usual fabricated rules and imaginary violations. The judge, an older man with a face carved by decades of listening to petty feuds and real tragedies alike, called the session to order, and it was immediately clear he had little patience for drama. Karen's lawyer went first, painting me as an unreasonable neighbor, a disruptor of community harmony, even suggesting that my refusal to allow the HOA surveyors onto my property had endangered planned improvements for safety and beautification. I nearly laughed out loud, picturing the three clueless men Karen had sent wandering around my yard like lost children. But I held my tongue and let them dig their own hole. Then it was my turn. My lawyer, a calm, sharp-tongued man who had perfected the art of legal assassination, stood and began methodically dismantling Karen's story piece by piece. He presented the county maps, the certified surveys, the footage of Karen's unauthorized attempts to seize my yard, and then the crown jewel, the evidence that part of the HOA headquarters encroached several feet onto my legally owned land. The courtroom shifted with a ripple of gasps. Even the judge raising an eyebrow as the photos and measurements were displayed for everyone to see. Karen's lawyer stammered through objections, trying to suggest the maps were outdated or the measurements incorrect. But then we called the county surveyor to testify. The man, a grizzled professional who looked like he'd seen every kind of land dispute imaginable, confirmed under oath that the HOA building was indeed sitting partially on my property and had been for years. The judge leaned forward, his tone suddenly cold, as he asked Karen directly if she had known about this encroachment when she tried to take action against me. She sputtered excuses, claiming ignorance, blaming previous administrations, blaming clerical errors, but her composure cracked under the weight of hard evidence and the judge's growing impatience. It was a glorious thing to watch. Years of unchecked arrogance finally meeting a force it couldn't intimidate. Then came the moment that sealed it. My lawyer argued that since the HOA had attempted to exert authority over my land illegally and was now proven to be in violation themselves, I had every right to claim legal ownership over the portion of the HOA property built on my soil. He handed the judge the paperwork for the injunction, requesting an immediate restriction on HOA use of the disputed section until full resolution of the claim. Karen's face drained of color as the judge reviewed the documents, his gavel tapping softly on the desk like a drumbeat of doom. When he announced that the injunction was granted, ordering the HOA to cease using the affected portion of the building effective immediately, the room exploded with murmurs. Karen's lawyer tried to protest, but the judge shut him down with a sharp, "Your client brought this on herself," before setting a trial date for final ownership determination. I glanced at Karen, whose eyes were wide with disbelief, her mouth opening and closing without sound, as if the queen of HOA fines couldn't fathom a world where her word wasn't law. As Luke and I walked out of that courtroom, the weight of years of harassment slid off my shoulders, replaced by a lightness I hadn't felt since buying my house. The crowd of neighbors who had come to watch erupted into hushed congratulations. A few even patting me on the back like I just won a championship game. But the battle wasn't over yet. Karen was a wounded predator now, more dangerous because she was desperate, and I knew she'd try every trick she could think of before the trial to claw back control. True enough. Over the next few days, my mailbox was flooded with letters from Karen claiming the injunction was unfair, begging me to drop the claim for the sake of the community, even offering to waive all past fines and give me permanent yard freedom if I'd let this go. It was almost comical seeing the woman who once strutted around like a dictator reduced to begging for mercy. But I ignored every plea because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every homeowner she had bullied. Every late-night letter slipped under doors threatening legal action over garden gnomes or mailbox paint. Every ounce of power she had abused for years. Now it was her turn to feel small, to have someone else hold her future in their hands. And I wasn't about to let her wriggle free. The final twist came a week later when the HOA board, sensing the ship sinking fast, called an emergency vote to remove Karen as president. The meeting was chaotic. Half the room shouting for her removal, the other half stunned that the queen bee was being ousted in her own hive. Karen screamed, threatened lawsuits, accused everyone of betrayal. But in the end, the vote wasn't even close. She was stripped of her title, left sitting in the middle of the room red-faced and shaking, realizing that the empire she had built on fear and bluster had crumbled in less than 2 weeks. As I walked home that night, papers in hand, the neighborhood quieter than it had been in years, Luke nudged me and said with a grin, "You're not just winning this war. You're rewriting the rules of the whole game." And he was right. Because with Karen dethroned and the legal claims still moving forward, it was only a matter of time before the building she once lorded over everyone would belong, at least in part, to the man she had tried to bully out of his own yard. For the first time since the saga began, I allowed myself to imagine the endgame not just as victory, but as poetic justice served to perfection, and that thought made every long hour of this battle worth it. The days following Karen's humiliating removal as HOA president were some of the strangest and most entertaining our neighborhood had ever seen. Without her constant patrols and ridiculous fines, the entire street felt like it was breathing for the first time in years, as if everyone had collectively woken from a bad dream. Neighbors who hadn't dared to so much as plant flowers outside their houses without Karen's approval were now throwing impromptu barbecues, stringing up fairy lights, and laughing loudly in their yards, no longer afraid of a $200 noise complaint letter showing up in their mailboxes. But even with Karen stripped of her title, the war wasn't over. The trial date for the property claim was still set. And until then, the injunction remained in place, meaning the HOA headquarters had to rope off the encroaching section of the building. Watching them put up those yellow barriers around Karen's old office felt like watching a queen's crown being melted down into scrap metal. The once intimidating building now looked like a construction zone of defeat, and people couldn't stop taking photos and sharing them in the neighborhood chat. The humiliation was spreading faster than wildfire, and I hadn't even played my final card yet. Karen, meanwhile, was unraveling. She had lost her title, but not her obsession with controlling the neighborhood. She would stand outside the HOA building, shouting at the new interim president, accusing the board of betrayal, of conspiring with me, of destroying everything she had built. Sometimes she would march past my property screaming empty threats about lawsuits coming any day now, but no one took her seriously anymore. Without the official power of the HOA behind her, she was just another angry neighbor shouting at clouds. And the more she flailed, the more isolated she became. I could have left it there, savoring her downfall, but that wasn't enough. She had tried to take my yard, trespassed on my land, harassed me for years, and terrorized half the community. It wasn't enough for her to lose. I wanted to make sure she could never claw her way back into power again, and I wanted the entire neighborhood to see that standing up to bullies worked. That's when I planned the barbecue. It wasn't just any barbecue. It was a full-blown neighborhood celebration thrown on the exact section of land now under dispute. The piece of property that gave me partial ownership rights to the HOA building. With Luke's help, I set up grills, tables, speakers, and a massive banner that read Community Barbecue. Everyone welcome except bullies. The symbolism was impossible to miss, and the neighborhood showed up in droves. Families brought dishes, kids ran around laughing, and people who hadn't spoken to each other in years were now bonding over Karen horror stories. As the smell of burgers filled the air, I grabbed a microphone and thanked everyone for coming, explaining that this land, the very patch they were standing on, was what Karen had tried to steal from me and what her building had been illegally sitting on for years. I told them how this wasn't just about my property, but about every single person who had been pushed around by someone drunk on power. The crowd erupted in cheers, a cathartic roar of victory and solidarity that made my chest swell with pride. And then, because fate has a wicked sense of humor, Karen showed up. She stood at the edge of the celebration, shaking with fury as she watched the people she once ruled, laughing and eating on the land she thought was hers forever. When she tried to step closer and scream about trespassing on HOA property, half the crowd turned on her, shouting back that it wasn't hers anymore, that the days of fear were over. She left in a huff, her face twisted with a mix of rage and disbelief. And for the first time, I saw it. The realization that she had truly lost, not just legally, but socially, her power shattered beyond repair. That night, as the party wound down and people hugged me, thanking me for standing up to her, I knew this was bigger than revenge. It was about showing that no one, no matter how loud or controlling, was untouchable. But my victory tour wasn't over yet. A few days later, the local news came back to do a follow-up story. This time, not about conflict, but about resolution. They filmed me standing in front of the roped-off section of the HOA building, explaining calmly how I had defended my rights and discovered the HOA's long-standing encroachment. The footage aired that evening, painting me as a folk hero of sorts, the neighbor who beat the HOA tyrant at her own game. Karen reportedly threw a fit when she saw it, screaming at her TV loud enough for half the street to hear, but no one rushed to her defense this time. Instead, even her former allies kept their distance, pretending they'd never supported her reign of terror. The cherry on top came in the form of a certified letter from my lawyer, informing me that with the mounting evidence, the HOA board had decided to settle before trial, offering me official ownership of the disputed land and a public statement acknowledging their administrative errors. They hoped this would end the legal battle before it got even uglier in court. I accepted on one condition. The statement had to include a written apology from Karen herself, signed and distributed to every homeowner in the neighborhood. There was resistance at first. Karen allegedly threatening to move out of the state before signing, but in the end, she had no choice. A week later, every mailbox on our street had a letter from Karen begrudgingly apologizing for overstepping boundaries, causing distress, and failing to uphold the values of fairness and respect. The wording was obviously forced, but it was there in black and white, a permanent reminder that the once untouchable HOA queen had been dethroned and humbled. The final blow wasn't legal or financial, though. It was psychological. A month after the apology, the HOA held elections for a new president. Karen tried to run again, thinking enough time had passed, but not a single person voted for her. Instead, the neighborhood unanimously elected a kind, reasonable neighbor who promised to undo all of Karen's ridiculous rules. Watching her walk home alone that day, shoulders slumped, was the most satisfying sight of all. As summer rolled on, the neighborhood transformed. Laughter replaced tension. People planted whatever flowers they wanted, painted their mailboxes whatever color they liked, and the patch of land I had reclaimed became a permanent community space where we gathered often. Every time I looked at that old headquarters building, now partially mine and stripped of its power, I thought about how close Karen had come to stealing what I'd worked for and how far she had fallen because she underestimated the one person willing to fight back. Revenge hadn't just been sweet. It had been necessary. And in the end, it wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for everyone who'd ever been bullied by someone who thought rules and power made them invincible. The final chapter of this saga unfolded not with fireworks or shouting matches, but with a strange quiet satisfaction that hung over the neighborhood like the calm after a long destructive storm. Months had passed since the battle that toppled Karen from her self-made throne, and life had settled into a rhythm no one thought possible when she ruled every street corner with her clipboards and citations. The land I had reclaimed and partly wrestled from under the HOA building was now fully mine, officially recognized by the county, a victory stamped and sealed that no one could contest. The once intimidating headquarters that had been her fortress of fines and threats now stood as a hollow monument to her arrogance, and what used to be her private office was now legally shared property. My property, and that knowledge gave me a sense of poetic justice nothing else could match. I decided I wasn't going to let that space rot as a bitter reminder of the war we'd fought. Instead, with help from Luke and nearly every neighbor who had once lived under her rule, we turned it into something the community could actually benefit from. The roped-off area where Karen once barked orders became a free library, a coffee corner, and a place for local kids to do homework without fear of being scolded for stepping on the grass. Every hammer swing, every coat of paint we applied to those walls felt like erasing years of tyranny and replacing it with something real, something good. The day we held the grand reopening,
laughter echoed through the space that had once been Karen's lair of intimidation. Families wandered freely where they'd once been forbidden.
Neighbors exchanged stories of past run-ins with Karen over ridiculous rules, and everyone agreed this was what community was supposed to feel like. The irony that Karen herself now had to drive past a building partly owned by the man she tried to destroy, a building she could no longer set foot in without my permission, was the kind of satisfaction no amount of fines or threats could ever take away. I would often catch glimpses of her in her car, slowing down as she passed by, eyes fixed on the place that had been her throne, her hands gripping the steering wheel tight as if she still couldn't believe it was gone. Once she even stopped, stepping out and standing at the curb like a ghost haunting a life she used to control. She didn't say anything to me, but I saw her lips move like she wanted to scream or maybe beg.
And for a second I almost pitied her. Almost. But then I remembered every humiliating letter, every bogus fine, every attempt to bully me off my own land, and that flicker of pity burned out like a match in the wind. Power had been her only language, and when stripped of it, she had nothing left to say. The final twist came on the evening of the first new HOA meeting under the freshly elected president. It was held in the same building Karen once ruled from, and the irony of it wasn't lost on anyone. I sat in the front row, Luke beside me, and the new president stood up and made it clear that the days of harassment, overreach, and petty dictatorship were over. The rules would be fair, the community would be heard, and no one would ever again be threatened or fined for trivial nonsense. The crowd cheered, a sound of collective relief that washed over all of us, cleansing years of frustration. Then came the announcement that made every jaw in the room drop and mine stretch into the widest grin. As partial owner of the building, I now had the authority to lease part of the space, and the new HOA leadership had agreed to rent it from me for a symbolic $1 a year under one condition. Karen, for the rest of her life, was banned from attending any meetings or setting foot on the property without my written permission. The roar of laughter that followed was deafening. The queen of HOA tyranny had not only lost her kingdom, but was now barred from ever stepping back into it unless the man she had tried to crush allowed her in. And everyone knew I never would. That was the final satisfying note that made the whole grueling war worth it.
Not just winning, but watching her legacy crumble into dust as I held the keys to the very place she had once used to terrorize others. As the meeting ended and people clapped me on the back, thanking me for fighting, I felt something shift inside me. This had started as a battle for my yard, for my right to be left alone. But it had ended with the entire neighborhood learning what it meant to stand together against someone who thought rules and authority made them untouchable. The little plot of land Karen tried to take became the weapon that dismantled her entire empire. And the building she once lorded over everyone with now served as a testament that bullies only win when no one pushes back. That night, as I locked up the new community center and looked out over the quiet, peaceful street, I thought about every step of this journey. The first time she threatened me over lawn height, the absurd spectacle of her sending fake surveyors to my gate, the courtroom showdown, the barbecue celebration, and now this final twist of fate. Every piece of it had led here to this moment where I wasn't just a homeowner fighting off a tyrant, but a neighbor who had helped free an entire block from years of fear. Luke joined me on the porch later, handing me a beer and raising his in a toast. "To the king of the block," he said with a grin. And for once I didn't correct him, because the truth was, while I had no interest in ruling anyone, I had claimed a victory no one could take away, not even Karen with all her old trick. And as for her, well, the last I saw of her that night was the tail lights of her car disappearing into the dark, a bitter shadow in a place that no longer bowed to her will. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been locked, gated, notarized, and stamped for all time, and the entire neighborhood had a front row seat to the day the tyrant fell and never got back up.